Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally.
Oh, welcome back, guys, to Lit Happens. And today we have the privilege of going through another Mod C text. And today we have Belle, who is going to be walking us through Nam Lee's text, Love and Honor and Pity and Pride and Compassion. And what's the last one there, Belle? And Sacrifice, isn't it? Goodness me,
Sacrifice.
It's a long title. Yeah. That's such a long title. But look, it's exciting going through a lot of these texts, and we hope you guys have enjoyed our standard text to date so far. So we thought we'd jump into our advanced texts, and what better way to start off with this beautiful, beautiful story by Nam Lee. And it's wonderful. I'm sure Belle's going to be speaking a little bit about the context, his purpose, and, you know, just the wonderful way in which the narrative is shaped, that we can sort of get our students to start to think about when it comes to their own writing in particular. But welcome, Belle. And I guess we'll get into a bit of the questioning. Could I just sort of ask you in general, what's something that stands out for you with this text? Why is it such a significant text in terms of an imaginative piece?
So for me as a reader, you know, because we're all readers of these texts, aren't we? When I read Nam Lee's piece, it's so poignant. And then I think for me, there's that real almost like pity in that, you know, sometimes people mean well, but they might not do great things. Or this idea that sometimes, you know, people can be elusive and there's a whole story and world behind them that we don't know that might offer, you know, a bit of a reasoning. I think I like it because it reminds me always of that idea of, you know, a text being mimetic in that it represents true and real life. And yes, there's realistic aspects of this story, but it represents that tension in family or that tension between, you know, people that you might be uniquely bonded with, but maybe don't always have a beautiful, positive relationship with, you know?
It's wonderful.
Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, I like that word tension there that you sort of spoke about. There are a lot of tensions, and it's a great little stepping stone from our last text that we looked at, which was Home. And it sort of really speaks about like that ethnic literature that I'm sure we're going to cover a little bit in our episode today, but how important it is in terms of the development of our fabric, you know, the narratives that we have running through Australia's sort of society. And it's definitely a fantastic text. But anyway, let's get back into the questions, and let's have a look at how Nam Lee's personal and cultural context influences his purpose in writing this text, and then how do we connect it to Module C's rubric, you know, in terms of the shaping of textual choices and meaning.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to start with Nam Lee. So Asian Australian, he actually comes to Australia. He's born in the late 70s, comes to Australia as a refugee with his parents, which is also represented in the story where there's that conversation between him and his friends about writing these ethnic stories, you know, and he says, I already wrote this story of my being a refugee. So he's definitely infusing, that life experience. So he's formerly a lawyer, and then in the mid-2000s turns to writing. And so where this story takes place is he is like a graduate student in like a writing program for a school, and he has to write a story. And so we'll talk more about it later, but there's this very metafiction aspect to the story in that he's bringing you into the process of writing, and he's exploring and discussing that as he goes. But that's, I think, the main sort of contextual features of who Nam Lee is. And people might also recall or know him for the text The Boat, which also became an interactive story. I think it was on the SBS website.
Yeah. It is still on the SBS website. I highly recommend for all teachers actually going through this text to get your kids to actually read that narrative online, because it provides like a really good context, but a framework for what you've just sort of spoken about in regards to that journey that his parents and his family take in order to get here. It some of the kids may have studied texts like The Happiest Refugee by Ian Doe, and they make those connections throughout the whole sort of thing. And it's a way of getting your kids into the narrative, into the text that Namli then leads on to in the text that we're studying today. But yeah, definitely The Boat on SBS, get your kids to look at it.
Yeah, it's a great one, isn't it? So when we're looking at now love and honor and pity, I'm just going to call it love and honor for all of our time's sake. It's a really unique text in that it's exploring like identity, culture, and the human condition. And like I said, the tensions that can be inherent within that as well. And so there's a lot of varied perspectives in how Namli tells the story. We'll talk a bit more about the aesthetics, the structure. I think he's really trying to engage people with the complexity of life, the complexities within family, and the complexities within, this migrant experience, because the stories are really, what we'll learn, and we'll talk about it more shortly, but what we'll learn is namely his dad comes to visit, and in that visit, we get an exploration of, kind of the horrific upbringing that his father was faced with, during the Vietnam War. And I'll explore that a bit more. But it's sort of that kind of, it's a text about trauma, about compassion, about pity, about bonding, about all those words listed. Like it's all there. And so, it's really going to give us those cultural insights, because Lee's perspective is of a Vietnamese Australian writer, which means he has that slight, more nuanced exploration of identity and migration and belonging, because he's part of that as a refugee, but also growing up in Australia, he's also part of that Australian community. So I know a lot of people who are first and second generation Australians, for example, they talk about kind of being in a bit of a backwards and forwards, or like this transitionary, like you try and tap into your, your ethnic culture, but then you've also got your national culture. So I think that's where Lee's texts are really powerful, because he's got that nuance.
I think you mentioned this idea, like he's got a dual identity there. So again, with that Vietnamese heritage and the Australian upbringing, we see the shaping of a perspective here of cultural hybridity and displacement in particular. And I like sort of that thing that you've just mentioned there in terms of, that father and that tension that he has. It's not a tension with his father, I don't think, but it's the personal trauma that I think the father experiences, and its artistic sort of representation. That's the way we sort of look at it within this text. That word representation sort of speaks pretty highly there. But I guess the question that you're going to speak a little bit about when we look at these sort of meta narratives that flow from this text is, how does one tell a father's story without maybe exploiting it? I think that's something that you'll probably definitely look at when we're exploring this text in terms of narration and all that sort of stuff. But I love this. I love, that the text reflects on the, ethics of writing, the ethics of dual narrative and identity and all this sort of stuff. And just a little segue, if you are doing Mod B, Artist of the Floating World by Ishiguro, I think this is a great text to get you thinking about some of the ideas in that close study as well. So if you're studying this concurrently, I mean, you can look at and reflect on, like I was saying, balancing these ideas of memory, sacrifice, and identity, which are key themes in that novel as well. So if you're planning your structure and the way you're looking at your text, that's one way I would look at it. But anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it also works really nicely with the Mod C poem stamp collecting. Those all work really well together. And you'll give your students that, not only that big picture connection across their text, but they'll start to see the patterns, and some students like to see the patterns to then inform them with what they're going to write for Module C. But great points you've made for sure.
100%. Anyway, let's get back into a few of these things. So let's look at the aesthetic qualities. All right. So what aesthetic qualities are evident within Namli's piece, and how might this encourage our students to consider aesthetic qualities of a text within their own works, and how they sort of implement this?
Well, when you're looking at, these aesthetic qualities, obviously we're looking for like beauty and representation here. And there is a lot of beauty in this piece, not just in the way that it's written structurally and in language forms and features use, which we will get to, but just in its actual narrative or its in intent. I know that last week you were talking a lot about the moral or the purpose or the didactic intent of a piece and how important it is for students to let that drive their story. I think that's what makes this piece so powerful because, on a plot level, we've got this budding writer. He's in a writer's program and his father has visited him. And there's that real classic, when your parents come too early and you haven't cleaned your house and you're like, you're like scrambling, like I have to present this facade of a successful human being, And so this idea of image and success and what achievement looks like is presented here. And so I think what Nam Le then gets to the crux of within his story is that, grief and trauma sometimes can dampen or outweigh any sense of achievement because there's this very tense relationship between he and his father. And we get it in little glimpses and we get it through, Nam Le's perspective here. But in the story, this tension between, not feeling like he could have a carefree sort of childhood, and so always that frustration with his father for that. And I think it's not until the story reaches its end that Nam Le then understands where that's come from, that the grief and the trauma has turned his father into this sort of person and has resulted in, the way that their relationship kind of unfurled in his younger years. So you've also then got a lot of, in terms of the aesthetic qualities, I would say the way that imagery and symbolism is used. It's very vivid, but it's also very emotionally poignant. So he's often using the symbol to represent the bigger aspect of family or sacrifice or identity. Like, for example, once he gets through the story, so in this narrative, Nam Le's having to write a piece for his program. And so once he decides he's going to write about his father's story, and that is that his father at 14 years of age witnessed a massacre by the American soldiers in his home in Vietnam. And so he writes this story and he gives it to his father to read. And as kind of the story ends, his father actually burns it. And Nam Le kind of towards the end ends, he states how a world can be shattered by a small stone dropped like a single syllable, because he's referring to that syllable of his name as well, Nam. We learn that Nam comes to represent the home that his father left behind. And so then there's that emotional resonance. So the aesthetics of this story, I think, is how feelings can be evoked personally, because he says, here's what I believe. We forgive sacrifice by our parents so long as it was not made in our name. To my father, there was no other name, only mine, and he had named me after the homeland that he had given up. Like, when you read that out loud, like, I just got tingles reading that, like that emotion and that real deep maturity in those lines and that perspective and that awareness and that understanding. So I think very much for me, the aesthetic aspects is how not only does the text represent that didactic intent and the moral of the impacts of grief and trauma and how it might stunt or impact our relationships, but also in how we can use tone and emotion and evocative language to represent that.
Yeah, I agree. There's quite a bit there, in terms of that emotional resonance that you've definitely been speaking about. And I think that really engages with our kids. And this is why, like, even when you're contextualizing the piece, we say, look at like those digital narratives like The Boat, because it pulls your kids into the story and gets them to really empathize with the things that are going on, and the way that Nam has actually constructed this piece in that aesthetic sort of manner. Definitely, I sort of love that. But yeah, look, I think that's great. Let's move forward into some of the distinct language forms and features of this text. So these are things that students will look to implement into their own work. How can they sort of read the craft that Nam has presented and then apply some of these distinct language forms and features into their own work?
Yeah, so obviously the way that he's using his descriptive language, because when you think about the story, the settings and even the time frame shifts quite a lot. So I think what Nam Lee does really beautifully is his descriptions are so clear and immersive that it's not particularly, I wouldn't say it's jarring. When he's in his teenage years reflecting on, the 16-year-old runaway with his girlfriend and then those issues, the fact, when we're in the present day, when he's recalling something from his youth and his father and his mother. So I think just the description in its narrative, the dialogue, I think is very, very distinctive here.
Yeah.
He's really capturing these really authentic voices with these cultural nuances, and that gives a real depth to the character, and they're more developed and they feel more real. So, there's a way that, Nam Lee's character speaks, and then there's a way that his father speaks. You've also got the interjection of the voice of the girlfriend, and the way that the girlfriend is used here to give us a piece of a puzzle into the stilted relationship between Nam and his father.
I think,
Yeah,
I think to add to like what you're just talking about, those different voices there, we see tone shifts or tonal shifts with that as well. So you can look at Nam's voice there as very introspective. It's an introspective voice, which he's sort of popped into it through his narratal sort of point of view there. And this is in contrast with his father's tense proverbs. I think he mentions, his father speaks to him in proverbs. So these are different things, but that flows through the entirety of the piece when we're looking at those different perspectives there. And like you were saying, it's very poetic and very evocative. I know, like for me, one of the most striking images is in the beginning of the text, when I think he mentions this. His voice was soft, his clothes heavy with his life. I love that line. I love that line because it speaks of experience. And it's like I smelled animals in him and fuel and rain, and like if kids have watched that digital narrative, The Boat, I mean, this is brought to life. Like you can literally smell it. So he blends like that sensory detail with the emotional weight that is driving the tension between the two of them throughout this text and throughout the entirety of the text. But it's fantastic.
No, absolutely. And I think you're touching on a really great point here too, that in the way that he does those descriptions of his father, he's not like ethically, it's this real ethical way of writing where he's not superposing things onto his father. He's letting his father's body language and all of that kind of tell the story of who his father is, rather than he himself necessarily. I mean, there are parts where he does tell, but this idea that his father's his own figure and his own man, and he also deserved to tell his story in his own way, which is, I think, where we get into that more meta elements of this text here, where all of these are consideration. And he says, my father, he was a soldier. He said once, as if that explained everything. With me, he was all proverbs and regulations. So he's giving enough to give us insight. But then there's the voice of the father that starts to come through in the latter half of the story that gives him that power as well as a character. And even when I think about narrative voice here, think of how even the protagonist shifts based on who he is in that part of the story. So there's parts where he's speaking like the former lawyer that he was, the budding writer, the teenager, the son, the boyfriend. So there's, you're right, that tonal shift and that nuance that's created in that sense of voice. So I think, for me, the things that really stand out in this piece in terms of distinct language forms is, the voice, the dialogue, and the rich descriptions.
And I like you can actually link your voice there to like structure as well. So it's very non-linear, this piece.
Yes.
And he jumps from, the different settings that he has. I think it's Iowa, this is present sort of Iowa, to Mai Lai,
Yes.
which is where the massacre occurred, the past.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
sort of like, it's quite interesting there, but it's a very hybrid. Yeah, that's right. It's a very hybrid form. I think that's another thing that teachers might want to look at when we look at some of these distinct qualities or language forms and features. It's definitely
you
a
make
hybrid.
a great point.
Yeah,
I think that's
definitely.
probably. Sorry.
No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
It's definitely a hybrid form. We got a mixture of fiction, autobiography, and I think you're going to mention this term metafiction, later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's definitely. But it's a short story with brevity. I think that's the important thing. It's this term that we keep focusing in on. But yeah, anyway.
No,
keep
you're
going
right.
on.
And if you're right. And if you make excellent points. And if you're, as the teacher thinking, I'm really strapped for time, this is one of those texts that a bit longer than maybe some of the others, but has everything in it. It's got, so you could very much, spend a good week on it and kind of cover a lot of your Mod C bases and then start branching off. Food for thought. But so yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Anyway, we'll keep going on and let's look at how Nam Le and how his style comes through in the piece and what considerations can students make in their own style of writing.
Yeah. So you just touched on it then, and it's an excellent one, that blending of the genres. Because when you look at a few of his stories, and particularly this one, there's a blurring of the line between it being fiction and memoir. Because there's elements where the kids might be like, but he's just retelling his life, but he's doing it in narrative form. So there's that blending there. And that's what I think makes this text so unique. Because he does that so well. It's quite difficult to blur genres, but I think because he's got his governing purpose, he's able to weave between those different elements and use them very holistically. And so it really challenges this idea of a traditional narrative story. Because there's another text as well in Module C Advanced that we might look at. What was it called again? What time is it where you are now? And it does a very similar blurring and that metafiction. And I think that's probably, specifically selected there for, your advanced students, because a lot of the texts that are in their HSC list are postmodern texts which blur lines and have elements of metafiction and meta narratives. So I think it's a good text for that. But anyway, that blurring between the fact and fiction, the qualities of metafiction is a real stylistic feature here, because as he's writing the story and you're reading the story, he's discussing the storytelling process. And not only the physical process of writing, but you mentioned a lot earlier when we started this episode, the ethics of writing. Yeah. And those ethical questions about authority in storytelling. So it's a really great text to get the students discussing those textual concepts as well.
No, 100%. And you've got like this idea here, like in terms of, I know we've sort of discussed that line there, the poetic quality of some of these lines, but you've got the idea of code switching and polyphony as well, which we can sort of go into a little bit
definitely.
further.
Yeah.
But
so
how does he use code switching? So
code switching, so you can see he uses code switching when he's addressing his father or talking a little bit in Vietnamese, but in particular where he's bringing in those proverbs that are like what his father is saying, but those proverbs are actually supporting the thematic concerns of what he's saying in this. So they're kind of two birds. Like it's again that idea of like brevity, like everything is so well selected. Yes, this is a cultural proverb tying into his father's backstory. Yes, it's the way that his father converses him, and again, probably tells us something about his characterization. But the lines are actually so well chosen that they're representing a nuanced issue or thematic concern that Nam Le's addressing in that moment of the story as well.
Yeah. And I guess if we add to that, that idea of polyphony here is where we're sort of looking at these multiple distinctive voices coexisting within the narrative, right? It creates this chorus of perspectives. And like we were talking about before, it provides not only Nam's introspective sort of analytical voice, which dominates the entire piece because it's like this whole thought process. We also see, again, the father's sort of proverb Latin speech, which really cuts through in terms of telling us about his past as a Vietnamese soldier, a lot to do with his Vietnamese tradition. And then, we sort of then move on to the friends and the cynical sort of banter that he has,
Yes.
with his friends there. I think he mentioned, I'm sick of ethnic literature, which is like a license to bore. I think you also mentioned the voice of, his girlfriend's Western sort of pragmatism there. So it's an external sort of
She's very
critique.
forthright, isn't she?
Yeah, that's right. Which frames Nam's struggle. And you sort of mentioned this idea here, how all of these voices, they work together. Okay, there's a chorus of voices, but everything's selected with a purpose, an intentional purpose in mind. And this is something that we want to get our students to really start to think about is
It's
every
showing
word
it.
matters. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, you're right. And just using those characters to show like filial piety being a very big thing in particularly Eastern and Asian cultures. And like you said, you got the range of perspectives, like you've got the girlfriend's Western values making a judgment call on their relationship. But you can see that Nam, even though he's not close to his father, and then there's for quite a bit of the story, he's not very empathetic, but then through the power of storytelling, through his father telling him that experience, things then link up for Nam, and it ends that piece on that like revelation of like, I mean, in a sense though, readers will still have questions, but I mean for Nam Lee, there's like, you can tell in the tone, there's like a sense of closure there.
Yeah, no, 100%. So we've spoken a little bit now about, some of these considerations, aesthetics. We've looked at, his style. And we touched a little bit on structure. Let's expand a little bit more on structure. So structurally, how does the text allow for a thematic cohesion to come through?
Yeah. So again, I think this goes really well to what you also explored last week, this idea of the purpose of the story is really fine-tuned. There's some key thematic ideas that are helping that come through, but it's the structure that drives those issues to come out to the reader. So that non-linear narrative structure, because it's really allowing to represent this fragmentation of time, memory, and experience. And that in itself is quite postmodern because, well, do we really remember things as they occurred, or, what's the complication there? So it just adds that further depth and layer. But, because it starts with him in real time, I'm trying to quickly think, it starts with him in real time, his father's coming to visit, he's trying to write his story. Then he kind of flashes back to, when he lived with his parents. He gives us a bit of when his parents separated. Then he's back kind of in closer to present day where he has that cynical conversation with his friends. Then he flashes back to the past. So all those flashbacks are very deliberate because they're propelling those thematic ideas so that the reader's actually developing what the overall kind of purpose or intent or commentary is in the piece. Yeah. I think as well, the other thing structurally, because we just discussed this, but that the different selves of the protagonist and how the different self represents a different, thematic idea, and how all those selves work together to represent, a complex person. And it's also what we then eventually get about his father, that while his father seems very straightforward on the surface, that deep down behind that facade, there's a wealth of experience that has led to that characterization of him. Yeah. The other thing I like as well is the title is very much very symbolic, in a way, a bit of an extended metaphor, because all those words in the title are what the text deals with and those concerns that are brought forth. And you also have that intertextuality being that nod to Faulkner, that when Faulkner, wrote his speech, these were themes of a very universal truth. And I love that, because it comes back to mimesis, that these are universal truths, and that how we might perceive love and honor and pity and all of those things, can be quite different. And that understanding and sharing and storytelling helps to demystify these things and represent them as like a universal truth.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and thematic cohesion.
Yeah, so I think that, even though there's so many different settings and voices and characters, overarchingly, they're all connected to represent ideas of love, familial love, ideas of sacrifice, ideas of identity. And so therefore, I think structurally, the voice, the narration, the characterization, it works well to solidify the theme, because all of those characters sort of representing one of those themes in one way or another.
Yeah, no, 100%. And then we started to look at, like, how does it all wrapped up in towards the ending there?
Yeah. So the ending is really clever, because while there is a realization for Nam Lee and a closure, the audience is kind of left with some questions, because there's like a distance between the readers and Nam Lee, which I think makes the connection between Nam Lee and his realization for his dad so much more powerful, because it's personal. Like, I kind of liken it to, you ever watched a film where a character gives somebody a letter or a piece of paper and they know what's on there, but we don't quite understand it. Like, we're not privy to that. We're sort of watching that exchange. So it ends with him saying, it ends with his father, like, burning the story that Nam Lee wrote about that massacre, and obviously the hugely pivotal and traumatic event that shaped his father's life. Henceforth, he ends with, if I had known then what I knew later, I wouldn't have said the things I did. I wouldn't have told my father he didn't understand, for clearly he did. So it's that real, and as a reader, you don't need to have the list of what he knew, what he understood. The closure is that there's a revelation and an understanding between father and son, and that's where I think is so beautiful as a reader. That's enough of a closure. I don't need to know all the details, but the fact that in their relationship there's actually some understanding now for why their life was the way it was. It's both beautiful and really upsetting at the same time.
No, I agree. And then it's like, it's definitely, if you want to link it to some of those key concepts that we see, like, key ideas that we look at in terms of good pieces, it finishes. So it sort of answers some of the questions, but it leaves some questions for the reader to think about and, continue to be attached to. And those are those moral messages that we're sort of speaking about. So, if I was to, that's right. So, if there were a few concepts, that we look at throughout this piece for our teachers to really engage with, you're looking at things like identity. We're looking at trauma and memory. Again, that's that link to the Bridge of Hesitation there with Ishiguro. You've got the ethics of storytelling, which we sort of covered a little bit in today's episode. Sacrifice, understanding, like, these are different terms that our teachers can really delve into the piece with. But also, this idea of moral messages. I think some of the core moral messages in this text relate or pertain to storytelling. You're talking about, like, the universal truth. So, storytelling definitely carries ethical weight. So truths like, for example, the massacre that his father experienced sort of demand a respect. It's not for the exploitation of art or fame. It's, this is that the storytelling that we're speaking about. Again, when we look at, like, ideas like the boat, personal sacrifice. Personal sacrifice
and
can't
taking
necessarily
care of people's stories.
But like, that's pretty big. And then, like, the big one there, I think, is this idea of grief and trauma, which outweighs achievement at times. So, this example where I think he sort of mentions, some stories should remain untold to spare memories bearers. And you see that with the image towards the end there, when, you see the literal burning of the story by his father. So there's definitely a few key things there. that we've covered. Like, you've done a fantastic job today in and actually covering some of the key ideas for our teachers here. Was there any sort of final thoughts that you had in terms of maybe meaning in the text that you could leave our listeners with?
I think in final thoughts, I think it's really important to have students understand the emotional weight that their writing can have
Mm,
when it's with purpose. I think
mm,
for me in this, it's that emotion that's so real and raw, and perhaps it is because of the blending of memoir and truth, and memoir and narrative, sorry, or fiction. But I
mm,
think what that leaves us with, what it should show to students is, we all have a story to tell. It's about
yeah.
how and why we want to tell it.
Mm,
And
mm,
so, yeah, I think it's a really great piece to encourage students to consider something in their life. And we don't want to be trauma bonding our students here,
no.
but just something, because I think the other powerful aspect of this text is the way that telling your stories is processing and is therapy and is moving forward.
Mm,
Like, there's a reason why his father told his son that story. Now, does he
mm,
necessarily want it to be published? That's an entirely separate thing. But this idea in the power in storytelling, in not helping other people understand us, but in allowing ourselves to understand who we are and what we're
mm,
shaped by. Yeah. And I think,
mm,
like, what a great way to get students engaged in what they're writing. A
yeah.
story of theirs or a story of a relative. Go and
Yeah.
ask your grandparents, go and speak to your uncles. Is there something, like a really important event in our family? Like, what do we think, what do
Mm,
we feel? And I just think that this text is so powerful because it's so real and honest.
mm, mm. Yeah,
Who
no,
wants to
I
write
agree.
about stilted family relationships,
Yeah, yeah.
But I think
We
that there's such power.
Yeah, we see this element here, like especially through this text, the power of language to evoke trauma's lingering presence. I think
Yeah,
that's
that's
quite
great.
like an
Yeah,
important sort of thing for people to sort of continue
absolutely.
to look at. I'm also struck, like I keep harping on about structure. Like this, if there's one
Mhm,
thing that I could leave with our teachers here,
mhm,
remember
mhm.
structure fractures time to mirror memory's chaos in this piece.
Yeah,
And it helps to
yeah,
form those questions of storytelling's validity. This is why I sort of mentioned that connection between this text and artist, because there's so much you
mhm.
can really connect between the two. But
Yes.
yeah, if we're talking about the power of writing for our student, well, like our students in particular, we can really get them to think about writing as being both a bridge to understanding, that bridge of
Mhm.
hesitation,
Yeah, yeah.
a bridge to understanding, but it's also a potential in this text betrayal of lived pain as well. So writing can
Yeah,
function in many different
yeah.
ways, but it's a
Yes.
wonderful text. It's full of meaning, and you've done a wonderful job today in exploring some of the great
Oh, thank you.
ideas.
We both did, I think. I think we've
With
had a really lovely conversation about the aspects of this text that really speak to you and
mm,
I.
yeah, no, it's definitely something that speaks to us, and especially being like an advanced text, we
Mhm.
really have to get into some of these more explicit sort of
Yes.
um, exploration or depth, I guess, of how
Yes.
things function, because that's
Yes.
expected in our cohort's work, then, in their craft. So, really get
Yes.
into the nitty gritty,
Spot
explore
on.
the text yourself as teachers. As you can see, there's probably another 2 hours worth of commentary we can have on this text,
Yes.
which we don't
Yes.
want to bore you guys out with. But look, if you're
Yes.
willing to listen to it, feel free to subscribe, like, and maybe share this.
Mhm.
And give us some comments. Do you like the longer episodes? Do you like the shorter episodes? What would you
Mhm.
like to hear more about?
Mhm.
And yeah, look, we'll do our best to deliver the content. Thank you once again, Belle, for just going through Namli's text today. I'm not going to read out
Thank
the
you.
title once more.
Pleasure.
We'll be
Yeah,
here
yeah,
for
don't
an
worry.
hour.
Yeah,
Um,
pleasure.
but it's such a great text. And
Yeah, it really
look,
is. It's so
uh,
powerful.
what a privilege. We'll see you guys again next week. Thank you once again for supporting us. And feel free to jump on our socials and just give us a like. Like I said, leave comments, and we'll be in touch with you guys. Thanks, guys.